Hi, welcome again to the Ville on Video. This is Dr. Charles Greenewalt, and this is Government 112, State and Local Government. We have gotten to the point in the semester where we're going to talk about political ideology and political participation today. Again, please remember, if you have any questions that are not answered during the course of this particular discussion, then you want to be sure to email me or call me. But let's talk about political ideology and what political ideology is. Please get out your PowerPoints and have them available so you can follow along as we move through the material. What is political ideology? Well, a good definition, one that I like, is a coherent and consistent set of beliefs. A coherent and consistent set of beliefs about who should rule, what principles the ruler should obey, and what policies the ruler should pursue. Again, a coherent and consistent set of beliefs about who should rule, what principles the ruler should obey, and what policies the ruler should pursue. Well, how do we measure ideology? How do we determine what ideology is? There's basically two ways to do it. One, we can ask individuals what ideology they believe that they possess. So the first way is simply self-description. Self-description. The second way that we measure political ideology is we look if an individual possesses a consistent set of policy preferences over time. A consistency of policy preferences over time. We find that when we look at Americans, it's not much of a surprise, but we find that Americans really aren't very ideological. Americans are not very ideological, and we find that Americans generally possess a varied mixture. Some positions that we refer to as conservative, some we refer to as liberal, some we refer to as moderate. Most Americans are not politically consistent. The only ones who tend to be are the individuals who work in government over a period of time. They tend to be much more consistent than the average person. Well, what are the ideological categories that we tend to use most frequently in the United States? Of course, they are the tired and overused categories of conservative, moderate, and liberal. Conservative, moderate, and liberal. You find that the definitions of conservative and liberal, in fact, changed in the United States, and they changed during the presidential elections of 1932. What is a liberal? What is a conservative? What is a moderate today? Oh, currently, we'd say that a conservative today is someone who favors a smaller government with less government intrusion in societal affairs. We tend to categorize a liberal, or define, I should say, a liberal as individuals who favor larger government with more intrusive programs in societal affairs. Moderates tend to be either people who possess a mixture of liberal and conservative viewpoints, or moderates tend to be individuals who always favor policy positions that are right in the middle between the conservative position and the liberal position. Let's take a look at, for example, if you were someone who favored, there's a terrible crime, let's see, there's a terrible murder, conservatives might favor the death penalty. Liberals might favor, a 20-year prison sentence, hopefully being able to rehabilitate that person. What would be the policy right in the middle? Well, the position right in the middle would be life imprisonment without parole. Maybe that would be the moderate position. Not the death penalty on one hand, and not 20-year penalty on imprisonment on the other hand, with release afterwards. Maybe life imprisonment without parole. So that's an attempt to try to illustrate that particular point. Now, those are the definitions of conservative, moderate and liberal today. What about in the past? Up until 1932, what were conservatives? Up until 1932, what were liberals? Up until 1932, conservatives were just individuals who tended to oppose the excesses of the French Revolution. They believed that the powers of the aristocracy, the church, and the state should be restored, and they believed that way too much blood had flowed through the streets of Paris during the French Revolution. Liberals, on the other hand, were individuals who favored personal and economic liberty. They favored freedom from controls and powers of the state. They supported the free market, and they opposed government regulations of trade. A liberal before 1932 sounds very much like, in many ways, a conservative today. In fact, there are people today who refer to themselves as classic liberals. Classical liberalism is the definition of liberal before 1932, as a matter of fact. We find that these terms had their meanings changed by one person, and that one person was, no surprise here, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president, he instituted a new practice called fireside chats. He wanted to try to keep the country informed as to what his administration was doing to try to alleviate the effects of the Great Depression. So he had his staff build a fire in the fireplace in the wintertime and in the late fall and the early spring. And you find that the sound of the fire with the crack and the pop of the wood in the background was kind of a reassuring sound, brought a more homey atmosphere, more comforting atmosphere to his presentations. So these became known as fireside chats. Well, during his fireside chats, Franklin Delano Roosevelt referred to his opponents as conservatives. If you were against the New Deal, you were conservative. If you were for the New Deal, you were liberal. And that is where we obtain the modern day meanings of these terms. In fact, if you look at your PowerPoints, you'll find a link there to FDR's first fireside chat. You could see him delivering it and hear his voice, hear that very patrician accent, and see what a fireside chat looked like. Well, we find that these categories of liberal, conservative, and moderate persisted all the way up until the 1960s. We find in the mid-1960s these terms become less and less relevant. And we find people with new policy positions that aren't easily captured by these three categories. We find that the first new ideology that emerged is referred to as neoconservatism. Neoconservatives were traditionally people who in the 1930s had been very, very much attracted to Marxism or a heavy dose of socialism. We find that they looked to the Soviet Union as the grand experiment and thought, what could be accomplished here? Well, after the passage of a number of decades, and they saw that the result of the grand socialist experiment in the Soviet Union was over 20 million Russians murdered by Lenin and Stalin, you find that they became a bit disillusioned with the idea of socialism and the grand experiment. And you find that they really turned 180 degrees. These people became known as neoconservatives. They were concerned about foreign policy and about taking a strong stance vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. also concerned with the social upheaval at home. You look at the United States during the mid-1960s, and we had every category of crime was up, whether it was arson, whether it was drug usage, whether it was robbery, assault. There was increasing social chaos, the social sort of there was a breakdown of the social fiber in the United States. And this led to the formation of this neoconservative movement. One of the leaders of the neoconservative movement was Irving Kristol, Kristol. Irving Kristol wrote a column every week for the Wall Street Journal. He wrote it on the editorial page, and it's some of the finest editorial writing in the English language in the 20th and 21st centuries. You might be familiar with his son, Bill Kristol. Bill Kristol, of course, was he was the chief of staff to Dan Quayle, Vice President Quayle, and then he was one of the founders of the magazine that just closed, the New Standard, I believe, that just closed its doors not long ago. But Bill Kristol, you'll find him on C-SPAN, you'll see him on CNN, occasionally you'll see him in Fox News every so often. But what did the neoconservatives stand for? The neoconservatives said, we have problems and they need to be addressed right now. We need to solve them now. And we have the tools in American public administration and public policy to do that. So neoconservatives said, we don't want government to be bigger. We don't want government to be smaller. We just want to make government work. We need to make government work right now. Those were the neoconservatives. A good neoconservative would have been Ross Perot when he ran for president. Find what was his appeal. He said, we want to throw up the hood of this truck of American government, and we want to get under that hood and make it work. And you find that his attraction to the American people and his great attraction as a candidate in the presidential race of 1992, which he didn't want to win, mind you. He wanted to have a say. He was a great patriot, and he certainly wanted to see that George Bush Sr. wasn't able to be reelected, but he really was a bit concerned when the polls showed that he might very well be elected. You find that what were some of the things that he did in his earlier life to show that he was a neoconservative. He was a graduate of the Naval Academy, just like Jimmy Carter. And then Ross Perot left the Naval Academy and formed one of the greatest businesses in the world that dealt with computers, electronic, and I'm forgetting the exact name of the company, but Electronic Data Systems, EDS. And he was really able to make that company take off when they got the contract for the Social Security Administration, ironically. But EDS established itself as a fine, reputable company that could solve all of your IT problems. At any rate, you find that during the Vietnam War, we had many prisoners of war held by the North Vietnamese. So come one of the Christmases, lots of Americans were sending presents to the POWs, and we find that the North Vietnamese said, well, we can't distribute these presents. There's too many, they're not sorted, so we're sending them all back. And only if they're sorted by camp and by person, by prisoner, would we be able to accept these. So Ross Perot stepped up to the plate and he said, okay, the government said it couldn't do the job. Ross Perot said, send all those presents to my facility in Alaska, in Anchorage, Alaska. And the government agreed, the United States government agreed. All the presents went up there, and Ross Perot pulled all all of his employees, many of his employees, from around the United States to Alaska, and within less than 48 hours, they had sorted all the presents. They grouped them by prison camp and by prisoner, and they put them on a private plane and took them to North Vietnam. What the government couldn't do, Ross Perot did. He replicated this again during the Iranian hostage crisis. During the Iranian hostage crisis, the Iranian revolutionary government not only seized the American embassy, they seized all the American businessmen in the country, including Ross Perot's employees, his EDS employees. Well, Ross Perot went out and he fired the retired general who was in charge of special forces in America, and that gentleman went out and he hired retired Delta Force members, retired SEALs, retired Rangers, and he had them trained for months. They built a camp like the one in which the EDS employees were being held in a jail in a border town close to Turkey, and they trained for close to a year. Well, when the time came, Ross Perot put them on buses. They went into Iran as tourists with primarily, I believe, Turkish passports. They went to the town where the prisoners were being held, the American prisoners were being held, and they set off incendiary devices, explosive devices at the one end of town in the middle of the night. Well, everyone ran to that end of town to see what was happening, and Ross Perot's force of retired SEALs and Rangers and Delta Force members simply waltzed into the jail where the Americans, the EDS employees, were being held, freed them, put them on a bus, and they drove right out of town and into Turkey. And again, what the American government couldn't do, Ross Perot did. There was a movie made about that mission, and a made-for-TV movie and a book, a book and a movie made about that particular mission. I think it was called On the Wings of Eagles. But Ross Perot had come to the attention of the American people pretty much as a neoconservative, someone who wanted to solve problems, solve them now, and not debate whether or not government should be bigger or smaller. Well, as the Republican Revolution continued, you had the critical election of 1968, and you have this realignment that begins, particularly in 1972. Richard Nixon, in his re-election bid for the presidency in 1972, Richard Nixon wins every American state except Massachusetts and except for the District of Columbia. You find that there were many Democrats who were beginning to fear, many liberals who were beginning to fear that the Democratic Party would never hold the key to the White House again. So they said, we have to deal with the neoconservatives and the increase in popularity and power of neoconservatives. And you find that in 1978, for the first time in Esquire magazine, you see the term neoliberal for the first time. What is a neoliberal? A neoliberal is someone who simply believes that we should use technology. If we use technology to its greatest extent, we will do what? Technology improves productivity. And greater productivity builds a bigger economy. With a bigger economy, we can give everyone a bigger piece of the pie, the economic pie. So we have neoliberals. Examples of neoliberals would have been Gary Hart, the former U.S. Senator from Colorado, of course, who ran for the presidency. You have former Governor Michael Dukakis of Massachusetts, the Democratic presidential candidate in 1988, who ran against Vice President Bush. Find Michael Dukakis was a neoliberal. Probably former astronaut and then U.S. Senator John Glenn from Ohio. He was a neoliberal. Okay, well, let's turn. There are three other strains of new ideologies that developed in the late 1960s and 1970s as well. Find the terms conservative, moderate, and liberal just don't encapsulate all the different policy ideas, the strains that are out there. Well, next we have the neo-progressive school. Neo-progressives were, what was the progressive movement? Remember, the progressive movement was the dominant theme in American history between the 1880s and the 1920s. What was the progressive movement all about? It was about reform, reform, reform. Reforming every section, every part of American society. Well, the neo-progressives simply believe that there are individuals who believe we need a new period of reform that touches every facet of American life, and we will be far better off. We need reform of the banking system, reform of elections, reform of the political parties and so forth, reform of the court system. These are the neo-progressives. Okay. Another strain of ideological thought we have is the libertarian school. Of course, the libertarian school acquires its name from the word liberty. And there is a minor party, the Libertarian Party. Libertarian Party is the major minor party in America today. They have put forth a presidential candidate in every presidential election since 1976. They may not have won, but they've had an active candidate in every presidential election since then. What do libertarians believe? Libertarians simply want as little government as possible. They believe the government serves just a few purposes and no other. What do libertarians think government should do? Libertarians believe that government should first of all defend our shores, national defense. They believe that they should handle external relations with the external world, so foreign affairs. They believe that the government should handle the national currency, so the need for a U.S. Treasury and the handling of national currency. They believe that we should have the government handle delivery of the mail. And most importantly, they believe that government should ensure domestic tranquility, should ensure law and order. So those are the basic jobs, the basic functions libertarians believe that the government should perform, no other. Okay, so the libertarian movement. And lastly, you have another ideological strain, and that's the communitarian movement. Communitarian movement. You find that the communitarian movement is simply one in which the people who are communitarians believe that strong communities, that in order to have a successful society, you need strong families. To have a strong family, you need strong families will build strong communities. Strong communities will build strong states. Strong states will build a strong nation. And they believe that we can achieve these things through self-help. Through community cooperation, and through not waiting for the government to help us. Communitarianism, you find great Amitai Etzioni, E-T-I-Z-O-N-I. Amitai Etzioni is one of the major sociologists in the end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century. Amitai Etzioni discovered communitarianism about a generation ago. He was enraptured by it, and he started a monthly magazine called the Communitarian Network. He closed his car garage at his home in suburban Virginia, where he was a professor at George Washington University, and he made that an office for communitarianism. He ended up writing several books on communitarianism, and he continues to put out the Communitarian Network, a magazine bringing people up to date with what's happening around the country. Great examples of communitarianism might be, as you drive into one area, one neighborhood or another, do you remember seeing the signs with a big eyeball staring at you? What does that signify? Well, that eyeball signifies that this is a crime watch community, that the citizens of that neighborhood have banded together to help the police, that they take turns driving through the community at night. They give the police extra eyes and ears. If they see anything unusual, they'll call the police, and the police will be able to come and respond to the trouble. That is a great example of self-help and communitarianism. Oh, another example, some years ago we had an enormous blizzard. I remember the blizzard, within a day, the snow had accumulated to my chest. It was that deep outside. But we find that there was an incident that occurred simultaneously in Washington, D.C. and in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. We find that both communities didn't have all their snow removal equipment up to snuff, and you find that there were two streets that were left unplowed in both communities where the people were very active and restless. We find that in both instances, community residents met. They decided on a Saturday morning they would go to the end of one of the street, and they'd all have their snow shovels, and they would clean the street themselves. And that happened both in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and in Washington, D.C. What a great example of communitarianism, of people engaging in self-help. So these are the different forms, different ideological categories. We certainly do not have just liberal, conservative, and moderate. Okay? All right. Well, let's turn from political ideology. Let's turn to political participation. And the first thing I want you to realize is that you have many ways to participate in politics. When we talk about political participation, we tend to think only of what? Voting, right? We have great voting records, and they're easily accessible. And so when we talk about political participation, we tend only to think of voting. But you can participate in politics in many, many different ways. You can participate in politics by talking about politics and government with your family, with your friends. You can write letters to the editor, to the newspaper. You can call a political talk show host on radio and engage in that. You can join a demonstration. You can visit one of your representatives, whether it be your state representative in Harrisburg, your state senator in Harrisburg, your county commissioner, maybe a school board member. You can attend political meetings. These are all forms of political participation. So we make a mistake when we think that the only way to look at political participation is by voting. Now, who are the people who most frequently participate in politics? The people that most frequently participate in politics tend to have the following characteristics. They tend to be Caucasian, they tend to be well-educated, they tend to be affluent, they tend to be older, and starting with the presidential election of 1992, they tend to be women. Up until that time, it was men. But since 1992, we find that women have become far more active than ever before. So again, the demographics for active political participation are that the individuals are Caucasian, well-educated, affluent, older, and female. Now, when we look in great detail at the topic of political participation, we find that maybe the best book on this topic for political participation in America was written by Sidney Verba and Norman Nye. Sidney Verba, V-E-R-B-A, and Norman Nye, N-I-E. They wrote a great book called Participation in America. And in the book, Participation in America, they've come up with their own categories to describe political participation in America. They've come up with 6 categories. Let's go over the 6 categories. The first category that they have is the category of inactive. These are your political couch potatoes. These are people who are not registered to vote. They don't follow the news. They never talk about government or politics with their friends or their family. They never attend any public governmental meetings. They're not involved with community organizations. Indeed, they are simply on their couch watching Jerry Springer. So these are the inactives. Now you can go to the other end of the political spectrum and you find that we have complete activists. Complete activists are individuals who are registered to vote, who vote in every election. They are well informed on all political affairs and governmental affairs. They certainly make sure that they do talk about these topics, these topics with their friends and their families. They're involved with community affairs. These are the complete activists. After the complete activists, we would have another category of campaigners. These are individuals who love the excitement and the camaraderie of a political campaign. They come out of the woodwork every 6 months. They come out of the woodwork just before primary elections and just before general elections. And they help the political parties work. Campaigners are registered to vote. They vote in every election. You find that they just don't like to be involved with politics and government 12 months a year, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Campaigners. Another category that we have are voting specialists. A lot of older people in our area would fall under this category. Voting specialists are registered to vote. They vote in every election, but they don't participate in politics or government in any other way. Many times when I stand at the polls on election day, some older individuals might come up and sometimes they whisper in my ear, "Who looks good today, Charlie? Who looks good?" You find that many of these people are voting specialists. You give them your palm card for your candidate or for your political party. They're very savvy voters. They'll take that in there. They'll use that to help guide their voting. And then if they're very savvy, they'll come out and they'll return that card to you so you can hand it out again. But these are voting specialists. We have two other categories of political participation left that were developed by Verba and I. One are parochial participants. Now, parochial, we tend to associate the word only with Catholic schools. Parochial means local. Parochial participants are individuals who get involved with politics and government only to solve a specific problem in their neighborhood or their community. It may very well be that I might have a pothole in the road in front of my home. So I will call my county commissioners, I will call my state representative, I might write a letter to the editor, I might talk to my neighbors about this. I would be very politically involved. But as soon as that pothole is filled, I would stop all those activities. That would be what a parochial participant might be. Lastly, we have communalists. Communalists are individuals who are registered to vote. They vote in almost every election. Communalists are very involved in community affairs. Find these are people who are involved with the JCs. These are people who are involved with the Lions Club, the Rotary, the Kiwanis. They very much want to give back to the community, but they do not want to be involved in political elections or campaigns. They fear and they do not like the friction, the adversarial nature of campaigns, and they'd rather not have that in their lives. So communalists are people who you will find in the service organizations in your town or city. Okay, if you have questions, email me. If you have questions that I can't answer by email, go ahead and call me. And stay up with your reading and your textbooks, okay? All right, I'll be back with another lesson right after this. Stay tuned.